morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being in our panel. I'm going to say that we are the best attended of the three. I will be honest, I did not look into the other rooms, but I think I believe that we are. Before I jump in, I just want to do a few logistics. We are videotaping our panel today so that we can hopefully put it up on the website when we're done. I'm actually going to ask our panelists, unfortunately we are the room because we are the best room. They trusted us with just one mic versus two. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists for their patience and cooperation in passing the mic down the line and back and forth. And when we engage the audience in questions, and as an academic, I'm going to look at each and every one of you in the eyes so it becomes uncomfortable until you ask questions. I'll just ask our panelists to repeat that question into the microphone so that it gets picked up by the tape. So thank you again for being here today for what I hope is a really engaging conversation about partnerships and community building. I'd like to begin by doing just a brief presentation, or presenting our panelists very briefly, and then asking them to speak for 3 to 5 minutes about their roles and maybe say a few words about their own perspectives on partnerships and community building. So Pastor Greg Edwards is the founding and senior pastor of the Resurrected Life Community Church in Allentown and the chief executive officer of the Resurrected Community Development Corporation. Dr. Bonnie Winfield is the director of community partnerships in the Center for Community Engagement at Lafayette College. Jim Harbaugh is the vice president of sales for City Center Investment Corp. And then Marci Ronald is the executive vice president of the United Way of the Greater Lehigh Valley. So, Pastor Edwards, if you don't mind, maybe just speak 3 to 5 minutes on your role and your view on this community.
Very good. Good morning. I'm used to, I'm a pastor, so I'm used to folk talking back at me. So good morning. Good morning. There you go. Probably a dangerous thing to have one. Good thing to have one microphone. My area of research really has been public theology and how public theology and the intersection of theology and sociology can shape community and neighborhood. And philosophically, I think my approach to engaging community really centers on really more of a sociological aspect and an economic aspect. There is a distinct difference between community economic development and economic development, right? Community economic development is much more sociological. It is much more anthropological. It sees the city as an ecological system where no part can be carved up or out without it impacting the totality of the city's soul or ecology, right? So that's what it means to make a city that's been good for some, great for all. And so my approach to the work that we do, both as a community development corporation that really engages in academic excellence and resident empowerment, it is really to not see others as being, to not see those that are different as being deficient, but to build bridges over that difference through talking, through conversing, through trying to develop a shared narrative so that everyone can journey to the same destination. So when we talk about community, one of the things we have to define, I always ask, well, whose community, right? Who gets to define who the community is, and who gets to define what the community wants for itself, right? Those are really critical and important questions because depending upon how you answer those questions depends upon the recipe you offer for the community, all right? So that's a little bit of me.
Awesome. All of that. Oh, I guess I have to say more. So I'm really interested in creating and recreating sense of place and particularities of place. My doctoral research was on recreating a sense of place in Syracuse, New York through a public-private housing partnership. And I interviewed women who lived in public housing and then purchased homes through a public-private partnership. And was really interested in how they defined home and their place. So my job, this is not my job, right? My job is at Lafayette College. And my mission in life is to create a sense of place and help the students create a sense of place in where they are located for those 4 years. So in the case of Lafayette, it is the particularity of Easton, right? I think, so, you know, it's really important for them to volunteer at the Nurture Nature Center. There's many community partners even in this room, right, at the Boys and Girls Club. But I don't want it to be something that they did while they were in college, right? So when they come back for alumni weekend and they're like, oh, remember when we were part of KIC together 40 years ago, right? I want them to experience what it means to be civically engaged in a community, in all ways, right? I invite them to come to the Planning Commission. I'm on the Planning Commission, those meetings with me, right? And we are expanding what we do at the Center for Community Engagement to include more areas of economic, community development, especially through the Nurture Nature Center. We have expanded many of the things we're doing in the jail, you know, with Women at Third Street Alliance. But more important, I want them when they're in 40 years from now to be an active member of their community and what that means. So that's my mission, and I am really lucky to have had jobs that I can actually do that. And as the Director of Community Partnerships now, you're all like on my list now. We'll do a little sign in. You can add to my list of community partners. So that's it.
Thank you. I'm Jim Harbaugh, and I work every day in the middle of Allentown at City Center, Lehigh Valley. I'm a corporate real estate guy by trade. I retired to come back to the Lehigh Valley, which is our home, 3.5 years ago, to be active in what's going on in Allentown. I've never had another job which feels more important. It's hardly a retirement project. But in reading the study and looking at those things pointed out, we live them every day in Allentown. I think we looked early on at what Allentown needed. And the PPL Center, while it is a great foundation for change, it is not the answer. And I think that was pointed out today and in the study relative to the Sands and other communities and municipalities that have relied on entertainment or sports. It's not the answer, it's part of the answer. From the very beginning, we've identified City Center's work and what needs to happen in Allentown as mixed use, to lay a base for change. The study does speak of some of the things that these venues do for cities, changes image, makes people prouder, creates some employment. All of that has happened in Allentown. I think it would be hard to say that Allentown hasn't changed, and that the perceptions of what's going on there, at least at many levels, has not yet, or it has changed. We're not in the bottom of the 8th inning, we're in the top of the 1st or bottom of the 1st as far as what needs to happen in Allentown. We started with economic development. We quickly realized that that wasn't the answer either. Building another office building is not the solution, but it's creating a base of change where there are now 3,000 people working in Allentown. Critical partnership created by the ANISDA board through Tri-City with the Workforce Investment Board Career Link. There have been 4 job fairs held in Allentown. For Allentown residents, 70% of the jobs at the Renaissance Hotel, at the arena, at the restaurants, are Allentown residents, many of whom walk to work. That's not the answer, but it's a great start. The companies that populate our buildings, including National Pen Bank and Air Products and Lehigh Valley Health Network, are committed to posting their open positions with the Job Center in Allentown. So we're looking first to create the base of change and then really switch to community development and partnering. I'm going to turn my page, because if I don't, I won't remember all my notes. So beyond all the buildings and the economics comes the community change. And the corporations that are coming back to Allentown are engaged. The foundations and charitable organizations in Allentown are engaged. The Neighborhood Partnership Program is a state tax funded program that will now be driving nearly $600,000 a year into issues like early childhood through 12 education, clean, safe streets, a variety of housing initiatives. All of that is funded privately, but also through some of the foundations. Programs are rolling out right now around employer-assisted housing, with facade grants and forgivable loans and other issues, other benefits for people who will live in Allentown. The Building 21 Career High School is being supported by private money, the NPP, and the companies that are re-engaging in Allentown. And that's a business, a professional, how do we talk about it? It's a career-focused high school. 150 children, 9th graders will enter it this year, and 150 each year until we'll have 600 children from the Allentown School District going through a career-oriented high school. There's also been the creation, Don Bernhardt is here with us today. Many of you know Don from his lifelong commitment to Allentown through the city and through PPL. The Downtown Allentown Committee Development Initiative has been founded to move forward in partnership on many of the same issues that we're discussing around education, clean, safe streets, and housing. There's something that he was telling me about the other day, which is exciting, a Pay for Success program. I heard him talking about going with a group to San Diego to look at some models of it. It's a privately funded process where every child will get high quality early childhood education. There's a lot of energy around that in Allentown right now, and there's a lot of support for it with great program models in Chicago and Boston. So my summary, and I'm probably at the edge of my 3 to 5 minutes, community development is the ultimate goal, but it had to start somewhere. And I think what we've done is laid the basis to allow these community partnerships to now work in a place that is a place, again, in Allentown. Thanks.
Good morning. I was thinking a lot about what I wanted to say this morning, and was reminded of my time. I had the opportunity and the privilege to go to Toronto a couple of years in a row now to spend some time with some of the best thought leaders around collective impact around the globe. And it was an incredible couple of weeks, and spending time with some of these thought leaders is just amazing and good for your soul, good for who you are as a professional and as a person. And the number one quote that sort of came out of the last summit that I attended in October that has really been something that is a top of mind for me every single day is that progress happens at the speed of trust. Progress happens at the speed of trust, and so does community building. And so as I was thinking about our role in on this panel, I was thinking, we were sitting down and Jim's got his notes and he's like, are these your notes? And I'm like, these are my notes. So I was thinking about community building, and I was thinking this is what we do every day. I mean, United Way, we community build, that's what we do. And so 127 years ago, we were formed in Denver, Colorado to be the community bucket, the community chest, where folks could pool their resources to ensure that good could happen in the community. And 127 years later, our role is still that role, but we're really being called on by our global network of 1,300 strong around the world to be a community builder, community change agent, because we're the largest nonprofit many times in our community, but also we have a unique role and relevance to bring and convene people to solve community issues together. So our United Way has really put a stake in the ground over the next 8 years around 3 specific goals. 80% of our investment will go into education. That equates to about $4 million each year going into education across the Lehigh Valley, with a 22-school consortium with 28 service providers and in 3 priority neighborhoods, which is a behemoth effort. And we achieve all of this work through a concept called collective impact, which I'll talk about in a minute. But, and then our second area is in healthy aging. Pennsylvania is the 4th largest older adult population in the country. Florida, Arizona, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. I'm from Ohio, so I can pick at West Virginia just a little bit. It's actually on my driver's license. I can say that if I want to. But Pennsylvania is 4th largest older adult population. This population will double by 2040. And so we're an aging population, and we have to think about what that means to our community. And the third area that we're really invested in is in food access. it's terrifying to know that in the Lehigh Valley there are 80,000 people who are food insecure. This would fill up the Iron Pig Stadium 8 times. About half of the people who are food insecure are people who are living above the federal poverty line, the working poor. And so it's people who just don't have enough. There's too much month at the end of their paycheck. And so I'm trying to figure out how to make ends meet and how to connect that. So when we think about addressing these issues and when we talk about community building, I think it's really important to go back to my first area and knowing that those are just our 3 impact goals. We need to declare something and to work towards something. We owe that to our donors. But also to begin thinking about our broader role and our role in relevance to the community as a community convener, community builder, and knowing that those 3 goals sit in some very complex issues in our community. And so recognizing the complexity of that is first and foremost very important, but also recognizing that the issues are complex, but community building is not. And so progress happens at the speed of trust. It's about relationships. I met Mark Hartney in the back over there playing a poker game on Friday night. My first time playing poker, I held my own as a very respectable person in Alan Jennings' house. I will have you know, very fine. I was at the poker game and I managed to leave with my dignity intact. And so it was a good thing. And all I keep thinking to myself is, we need more poker games. We need more conversations where we're sitting and talking to each other. There's a lot of amazing and good stuff happening in this community. And as I was sitting there listening to each of my colleagues here on the panel, thinking, how do we lift up what each one of us is doing and not see that in a competitive space? And to lift each other up rather than tear each other down and say, my initiative, my program, my work is better than what you're doing. And so when I think about community building, it starts with what's happening in this room and with you and at the poker table and in other places. So thanks for the opportunity to be here this morning.
I just want to add that maybe we could add some drum circles to those poker meetings.
I'm always
Prayer meeting.
Mic drop. So as you can see, each of our panelists comes to the table with really unique perspectives on community building. So I'd like to start off by asking a question to the panelists, but then I'm going to open it up to our audience. And I encourage our audience members to really be active contributors to the discussion. So please respond to questions, ask questions. I'm really hoping that this is a dialogue and a discussion. And so while these wonderful 4 panelists have volunteered their time, they're not the only experts in the room, so we really do want your input as well. So the first question I have of our panelists, and also for everyone in the room, so take notes. Or what resources or strengths for community building do you see us having in the Valley, and what steps do we need to take to best leverage those resources to build effective coalitions?
That was 3 questions, right?
It was 3 questions.
So, I mean, I'll just start. I think our greatest resources are people, right? They're not buildings, they're bodies. And so, as Marci said, it's about relationship building. And I'm going to tell you, the person that has the best capital has the best social relationships. Social capital is the greatest leverage, I think, for change, right? Deals are done through relationship. Neighborhoods are started through relationship. I think if we don't start there, if we see a program, a program is a conduit, but a program without the right relationships is just a program, right? Programs don't change neighborhoods, people do. So I say you start with what you have. I think there have been some metaphors that have been agrarian agriculture. The master gardener says, I dig where I stand. This is my city, this is my neighborhood, and even if I don't get another grant or another dollar, I'm going to make do with what I have with the most valuable asset in front of me, which is not, from my perspective, currency. The currency for change is people, and the bridge for that change, as Marci said, is trust. So I think it's really, I would start through. I know it sounds like a soft skill, but conversation, right? And that's what begins to frame the work. Conversation, relationship, trust, and through those very important mechanisms, programs almost become secondary, right? Goodwill begins to emerge. Competition begins to be placed on a shelf. And we are able to work at this together. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, go together, right? So going together means you see that folk are the most valuable asset and you work with them. And that means everybody. And for me personally, philosophically, it means I don't need to necessarily believe what you believe to believe that you belong. And if you don't start from that perspective, you already start with a limited table, because most of us will invite to the table individuals that we are most comfortable with. And the Lehigh Valley does not look like this room. Newsflash, right? It is an increasingly black, brown, Latino, biracial, it just is, right? And at some point we'll probably talk about the Allentown School District, which we saw already on the chart, unfortunately, but that is always going to be an issue within our city, right? And those are predominantly children of color. Does anybody think not otherwise? Okay. And so we cannot see that as other people's kids. We must see those children as our kids. And I think if you start from that perspective, you begin to prescribe a different medicinal outcome for those children. So
I'll further that with relationships. So when I did my research of the women in the housing projects, they taught, when I was talking about their homes, I was really wanting to talk about the houses that were built, and none of them talked about the house. They talked about those networking, about family stories, and when I interviewed the administrators of those programs, they did the same thing. So it's all about those connections, relationships. And so what I would like to say as a great resource, which is fitting for today, this morning, right, is the colleges and universities, right? And specifically the students. Last semester, I taught a class on civic engagement, leadership, and social change. Many students take these courses and they learn about the problems and they're like, oh, I'm gonna go be a nonprofit director, which is cool, right? I'm not discouraging that, right? But they might be in engineering, right? I don't want their parents calling me the next week and say, whoa, Dr. Winfield, what did you do here? So we had this program that we called Civic Engagement Champions. We brought 7 people from Easton area that went beyond their jobs, right? They had a certain job, one owned a call company, and yet he is like a major person in Easton building. He did the masquerade ball that I think was just in the morning call just a couple weeks ago, and he went above and beyond and was civically engaged, even though his job was something else. And the students were like, wow, this is awesome. Like I could do this work in another way and still have my job, right? I can still do this. And so teaching about that, the way the students learn about that is by meeting people like you, right? Having conversations with you. And also all of the issues, as we saw this morning, that faculty and staff and students at these colleges, I mean, they're majorly smart. You know, I mean, they're unbelievable, right? And so they could do that research and help us solve those problems. I just heard a presentation yesterday. A young woman did a study at the Northampton County Jail about psychological well-being. Amazing study that we're now going to pass on, right? And so having all of those conversations and that inclusion, just a little note, because I actually do volunteer work in the jail with art therapy, they are a community of people that are always excluded. And they are never at any tables, right? And so to be more inclusive of everybody's voice, I think is really important, and those resources. College, people, right? Drum circles. They do drum circles.
I came back to the Valley after being gone for 20 years. And as I got more involved, I lived in Doylestown, so it wasn't that far away. But came back to the Valley, to our home. And immediately, almost 4 years ago, got embroiled in Allentown and became rapidly aware of the depth and the breadth of the issues that the city has. and that most of our cities have in the United States. I don't think we are specific in the issues that we face. It's good to know there are others in the boat with us trying to pull the oars in many different locations. What I found most interesting then, and I'm feeling it changing, is that when I talked to folks, everyone had the same idea. There was a commonality of, here's what we need, here's how we should approach it. But for the most part, they weren't talking to one another about it. They were talking to funding sources about it. And it dawned on me very quickly that people needed to talk more to one another to build the kind of consensus around, what are the 5 big ideas we have to get after? How do we approach the problems we have together? And I think events like this, studies like this, and truly the collaboration that I think we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years is beginning to change what I saw when I came back. So it's been, I think, a unique and interesting 3 or 4 year period that's happening in the Lehigh Valley as all 3 of our cities are going through changes. All 3 of them are succeeding. All 3 of them are failing in some ways. But I think the sort of global collaboration that we're seeing is uplifting. And the other thing I'll say is that we've been inviting the colleges to come downtown to see what's going on, and some of them are holding classes in some of our facilities downtown. And these kids are way smarter than I was when I was in college. They have energy and ideas and want to be involved in the conversation. So I think that's a really important piece of this too.
I would echo everything that my colleagues have said here, but I was thinking back to the original question around what resources do we have here that helps with community building, and there were 3 things that sort of were popping into my brain. I think we're getting smarter. I think there's a lot of data out there, good data, that we can then use to make good decisions. United Way, we have a phrase that we use a lot: without the data, the chatter don't matter. And so we really kind of, and so it's like, show me the data. And so our president often says he's from Missouri, he's the show me state. So show me what the data actually says. So I think the information that's contained in this report or in some of the other things, the planning commissions, one Lehigh Valley report on affordable housing, and some of the things that are sort of out there, I think are really help us to have informative and informed discussions. The second is just the massive leadership transition that's happening. I think both in terms of, so that those are kind of lumped together, but I think leadership, just in the last 3 years, we saw of 17 nonprofit leadership changes. And that's just at nonprofit. We're not talking school district and corporations and businesses, and sort of we're seeing, at college level, and we're looking at the changing of the guard in our community. And so I was just reading an article, and Pastor Greg and I were having a conversation earlier this week and talking about diversity and inclusion and cultural competence and sort of all of this. And one of the articles that I was reading was talking about the fact that we have a supply and demand problem, right? So we demand more inclusion and diversity and relevance and connection, but are we doing enough to build the supply? So are we building the right pipeline of leadership in our community and thinking about leadership at different levels and different sectors? And so I think we have, so that's an asset and a resource and an opportunity for us. And the third is I just think we're in the right climate for change. And so much is happening, the Renaissance in Allentown, so goes Allentown, so goes the rest of the valley, I think some could argue. But, as I go out and drive out to Slatington and out into other places that are part of our community, are they feeling the ripple effects of those changes? I'm not sure. And so when we're talking about, community and talking about how to connect those pieces, I think we need to be thinking about how do we create folks who can disrupt some of those systems in other places around our community and can be a part of that conversation. So I think those are some of the best resources, but as the folks at Tamarack Institute taught me, the collective wisdom, what we need to know and what we need to do exists within the room and the circles that we create. So how do we create the right place and space where that collective wisdom can emerge?
Thank you. So now I'd like to open it up to the audience. What other resources do you see in our valley?
Well, I have a question, actually.
Absolutely, and I'm going to pause real quick. If whoever is closest to the microphone, if you don't mind just repeating, or I will repeat, we'll figure out more the question. So it's going to be a call and response.
Yeah, it's sort of a broad question to the whole panel, since we're here to talk about data today. Marci, you were just talking about it, but data looking forward. If you had to identify just a few characteristics of a thriving, healthy neighborhood, characteristics that are measurable, so 5 years from now, we'll have something to look at and say, gee, we were successful or not. What couple of things do you think are the most important measurable characteristics of a healthy neighborhood?
So for anyone who may not have heard, what are the characteristics of a healthy neighborhood? What type of data do we need to see and measure to know that our neighborhoods are healthy?
My response to that is that it's not up to me. It's not my neighborhood. And so, I mean, you know, I think we could, I was thinking of, there was a Charlotte Gardens and sort of in the New York area talking about community development. And they said they had a list of community indicators that they used. But one of the things that they used was they wanted to know how many barbecue grills were popping up in the backyards. You know, are people staying? You know, are they hanging out with their friends? Is their quality of life? Well, I don't know. I'm not going to suggest we go around counting formans. But, you know, but I think that in terms of community indicators, there certainly are, and this would point to several things. I'm not trying to blow off the question. I think there are several things that research would point to that indicate positive, vibrant, healthy neighborhoods. You know, people feel a sense of belonging, connectedness. Are the streets clean? You know, crime. You know, all of those things. But I think it goes back to this conversation that, you know, we need to create a place and space where the community and the neighborhood determines for themselves what a good, viable neighborhood looks like. So, anything else wants to add?
I'll add just one thing, that one of the things that we've all talked about today is education. And I think it takes a while to measure success in education. That's not a 1 or 3 year solution as far as my brain. As we start to invest more and more in early childhood education, you know, we won't see the benefits in 11th grade for 7 or 8 years. So I think it's hard to really measure some of the important issues, but I think they can be looked at as trends until we really know.
Yeah, I'm not trying to measure this, but I think engagement, especially, of course, civic engagement. So a sense that people can have their voice heard and make a difference. So little story about that has to do with Easton, and it has to do with urban chickens. So there was a meeting at the Nurture Nature Center about urban chickens. There were many people in Easton that wanted to have their little chicken coop in their backyard. And raise their own hens, right, and have their own chickens or a pet or whatever. There were probably, I don't know if you were there, 70, 80 people at that event that were either interested in having them or interested in the topic. 2 weeks later, this topic was going to come up before the city council, and they were going to make a decision. I stood up and said, all the people here who are really interested in this, you need to do your homework, right? Cities like Binghamton, even Manhattan, there are many cities that have addressed all of the issues that the city leaders, the city council has brought up, especially the health department, right? Go do your homework, come to that meeting, and when they bring up those issues, say, you know, disease, oh, hello, this is what they did in Binghamton about that. I went to the city council meeting, 4 people were there. I was so disappointed, right? Trying to teach the students, be engaged. But people didn't feel like they could be, their voices would be heard, that they could make a difference, that they even knew the meeting was happening, right? So I think that, and how you measure this, I'm not really sure. I tell stories, I don't do the measurement, right? But people who think that if there's a problem in the community, they could at least go to the city leaders or go to the meeting and have a difference made, right? I think in the West Ward of Easton, many people don't think it matters what their voice is. And so, you know, they might be transient people or whoever. I think even the leaders in the West Ward don't feel that way. So in some way, having that engagement and be heard.
So is there any other audience members like to contribute either about healthy neighborhoods or resources that we have in our valley? Yes, please.
I think too, in answer to that question about how do we assess whether a community is healthy or not, some of the things were mentioned too. Food insecurity, what proportion of the population is food insecure? Housing insecurity, affordable housing. If you're on minimum wage, you need 2 and a half jobs, which is the current statistic, in order to afford an affordable, fair market value apartment, two-bedroom apartment. Proportion of people are employed at a fair wage. So there are those kind of social need indicators as well as health-related indicators that would be residents or health outcomes. But it's it's both the social needs as well as the health outcomes. And I think this was the beginning and looking at one level of sort of educational attainment is one of those, but all of those factors are very important in assessing is this a healthy community. Also, a sense of place, I think, is critical. So is there transiency within the community? Are people staying in the neighborhoods? Do they feel a sense of place? And when we look at Allentown and certain parts of Bethlehem, but more in Allentown, I don't think people have a sense of place. And when we did a focus group in Allentown a couple of years ago, there was a totally different sense of place between those who were renters and those who were homeowners. The renters who lived right downtown Center City, Allentown, they were looking to move up in the block. I'm at 4th Street now, I strive to go to 15th Street. Then I strive to go further out. There wasn't that sense, and that's what we heard from the renters. And there was also a different perception in the neighborhood between the renters and the owners. The owners didn't feel, they felt safe. They had a sense of community. They knew the other owners in the community. They didn't know the renters. The renters felt unsafe. They were afraid to go home at night sometimes after their shift was over. So when you talk about relationships and getting people together, that's important. As we said, everybody needs to be around the table, not just the haves, but also the perceived have-nots as well.
So I think there were many factors that you were speaking of, and the food insecurity is a really important factor. Easton area has just started a hunger coalition that Nancy Walter started that at the Nurture Nature Center, and it was amazing, and that's continuing, right? It's alarming, and many of you probably already know these statistics about the number of people the children who go to bed hungry. 1 in 4, I think the statistics are, right? Amazing, unbelievable stuff. Then the other thing is the affordable housing. It is an issue. I am a renter, and it's interesting the conversations about renters and homeowners, right? But it also depends on that neighborhood, right? So downtown Easton, where I live, it's almost all renters, high-end renters, right? But the West Ward, it's a different story, right? And so how do we look at all of that? And sense of place, of course, which I've already spoken to. So.
And I would just say, when we're talking about building community, when we actually listen to people's story, in psychology there's called stacking, right? And our children, just to use our children for example, when they show up for school, if you are in a community where there is no, I know it sounds like a soft skill, hope, right? Dr. Skinner and also Snyder have developed this concept of hope theory. There's a hope theory scale where you could actually metric out one's level of hope, because hope is the currency that pays for my tomorrow. And when you are in our communities, many of our communities that are dealing with ongoing traumatic situations, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And so some of the reasons why, children drift off in school has nothing to do with them not valuing education. It is the only safe place they can sleep. And if you've never lived from that perspective, then what we begin to do is we begin to blame and say, well, I did it. Why can't they do it? But our communities, and I'm talking specifically about inner city urban communities, what we don't understand is the history of what's happened in many of those cities, right? There was the 1949 Urban Renewal Act. There was disinvestment. There was deindustrialization. There was predatory lending. There was all of those things impact our community. There were certain segments of our community that were not allowed to move up and on because of discriminatory housing laws. So other entryway communities and other folks that were able to move up and out, those communities in many regards became ghettoized, right? And part of the legislation that came around federally was to remove, if you will, those ghettos that in large part were social networks where the barbershop lived next to the judge, and what we did in large part is, there's a Columbia, she's from the University of Columbia, and her name is Mindy Fullilove, and she wrote a book called Urban Alchemy, Root Shock, and it talks about this allostatic load of what many folk in the community have to go through just to survive, just to eat, just to think, just to be educated. And if you are developing a program or an initiative and it doesn't take into consideration that, even in the conversation of building relationship, right? Because I say when you meet folk, most folk, when you meet them for the first time, they will tell you there's two types of stories. There's the parlor story, the polite story we tell to folks that we don't know. And then there's the real story. There's the kitchen story. Because most of the good stuff happens in the kitchen, right? And our communities have a lot of kitchen stories. And it's the kitchen stories that have to be leveraged in coalition building to really effectuate change, right? So if we try to build programs around the parlor stories and we wonder why doesn't anybody show up at the meeting? They just don't like their kids. Well, and we write folks off because the program has not reached the kitchen story, it's reached the parlor story. And if you really want to effectuate change, you got to change how folks see themselves in the community in order to raise, if you will, the overall competency and health of that particular neighborhood. So.
Yeah.
I have a question that does not have an easy answer, but I understand the value. I understand the value of this coalition building with listening, but it's bringing those stories back to the institutions, whether they're reporting back in a quantifiable degree of how much time did you spend building those relationships, and what value does that have for us who's paying for you for that time of relationship building. And so it's the quantification of the work that, and it's not just learning institutions, but it's also corporations that spend so much time not in just relationships starting, but stewarding. And I would ask any kind of suggestion for wrapping our heads around how do those of us who are passionate about these relationship building, showing the value of that back in our report, so that, because that's a big part of policy change, is giving the time, because time is money. See, not an easy answer, so.
Just picked up on the mic, so the question is about how do we, for lack of a better term, quantify the relationship building that's the behind the scenes work that is done to build the foundations for successful coalitions. So how do we quantify that in a way that it becomes meaningful and valued in the current way we value it?
I don't have an answer, but I do want to say how important it is, and I think time is the issue, right? So even if at Lafayette College, when I want to get together with my colleagues who aren't on the same committee, maybe, whatever, right? We are so busy. Even the students, their agenda books are like totally full, right? Can we have a meeting about this? Come down and listen to the stories that the women are telling me at the studio, like, oh, I don't know, I don't have time. And I think we somehow need to change how we go about our everyday lives, right, in some way, to be able to listen to those stories, first of all, right? How we quantify them, I'm not sure, right, but it is really true. So, and I have to keep talking about the women because that's who I work with the most, but telling their stories, people just think of people in the jail as bad people. They made these big mistakes and that's who they are. But there's way more to their story, as we've heard about other things too. And so I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really important question.
I'm really, I have two minds of what you're asking, and I'm not sure that I have an answer in either of them. So the first thought that was coming to my mind was quantify for who? And so I'm not sure, I'm not sure that there's an answer that I'm curious to unpack. I'd love to talk with you after. I'm really curious about where your brain is on this. And while community engagement, community conversation is an important part of, I think, community problem solving and community building, at some point we have to stop talking and do something. And so, and not that we just stop talking completely, because continuous communication is a part of the discussion. It's sort of like a corkscrew, right? We just sort of go, we do some action, we stop, we assess, where are we, let's talk about it, et cetera. I mean, when you think about everything that's happening in Allentown, I mean, that, if somebody said that 10 years ago, they'd be like, are you crazy? Like, that's crazy, right? You're gonna put an arena in the middle of Allentown, like a hockey arena? And so, and when we were introducing our impact goals to our board, I said at one point, I hope one of our board members said, have you lost your mind? And the reality is, if we, if we keep doing the same thing we've always done, we're gonna get what we've always gotten, right? Very cliche thing to say. But at some point we have to do something. And so we take the information and the conversations. So you listen to a lot of those pieces and then you do something with it. And you be prepared for, I was in one of the communities that I was in was talking about celebrating failure. And one of their communities, they actually started having a wake for a failure, a failed idea, which I love, right? How do we celebrate the fact that you took a risk, that you tried something, and it sort of goes back to that concept of trust. So I don't really know how to quantify it for you. I can tell you that if you were applying to the United Way, I would find a way to make a report for you to give me and to quantify that in some way. But I say that in sort of tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is sometimes you have to quantify it. Depends on who you're quantifying it for. So I don't think there's an answer to your question, but it's an interesting question.
I'll add one thing, and I know in my own schedule, and as I booked from moment to moment, I'll often go to a meeting, a variety of different kinds of meetings, and walk out and I went to the meeting, but I wasn't engaged in the meeting. And so the challenge is, how do we measure engagement? And I think that's probably what you meant, because measuring hours sitting in a room isn't terribly helpful. But measuring engagement, finding the right constituents to be engaged. Pastor Greg talked about that. How deep do we go? How wide do we reach to engage in the problems, and then spend the right amount of time with the right people, doing and thinking the right things. So I think it's a distinction with a difference relative to true engagement in these things.
Yeah, I'd like to take the conversation in another direction and pick up on a point that Marci made. I'm working with a nonprofit. I'm president of the board of Third Street Alliance for Women and Children in Easton. And so one of the things that you mentioned about various nonprofits all chasing the same funding sources. So what are ways that the nonprofits band together to affect leverage greater change? One of the things that we're doing at Third Street Alliance for Women and Children is we join forces with other nonprofits in the Easton area to look at ways to remove barriers for women that are seeking employment. Just getting to career links offices in Allentown, for example, on public transportation when they are available to go is a barrier. So it's just one example. So I think there are ways, as we think about building community, to look at the community of the nonprofits throughout the Lehigh Valley and ways that they can partner together. And I know United Way does a lot of that, has been a leader in that effort.
So I'm just going to, so we can pick up on the tape. So the question was about how nonprofits can band together in collaboration and cooperation to move the needle. And I'd like to piggyback on that because it sounds like it's a very successful initiative that the Third Street Alliance is engaged in. So perhaps building on that, not only how can nonprofits work together, but what are some examples that you've actually seen of other successful partnerships that have worked? We've talked a lot about need, but where are some of the success stories, and can we scale those upwards? So I guess it's a twofold question. If you don't mind me piggyback, right?
I just want to say collective impact before you do. so that there's more than one person saying about collective impact. It's amazing, and Marci's the expert, not me, but that is really a way. I think a really interesting, successful example is the Reentry Coalition for the Northampton County Jail. So it started many years ago. Arnie Matos and I brought together every community partner, and I think maybe some of you here were at that, to talk about the issues that were facing people when they re-entered the community. It was a massive room, and we had round tables, and then that led to this Reentry Coalition that I think is doing major issues, and it's probably part of the group that you're working with, hopefully. So, but I know you have lots more to say.
I think there's, the term collective impact, and I'm not the expert, there are a lot of people who hold different ideas about this. So if you haven't heard about collective impact, I would encourage you to take a look at it. There's a website called the Collective Impact Forum, which describes it. It's simply a matter of disciplined collaboration. That's really what it is. And so many of us have lived through the years of death by collaboration, and so of sitting at coalitions, at partnerships and meetings where you're talking about the same thing with the same people over and over, and nothing is happening. And so what I love about collective impact is that it's a disciplined form of collaboration, and it helps to sort of frame the discussion. I think, though, there's another piece of this that I need to say, and that is sometimes part of our discussions are around helping, if we're just talking about the nonprofit sector, but not just the nonprofit, but the various sectors, that it's not about you, it's about the issue. And so, and that's a really tough thing to swallow, because we are in a competitive space trying to just preserve our own land, our own viability sometimes, our own lifeblood. And so when we talk about nonprofits banding together, the reality is we have about 1,000 nonprofits in the Lehigh Valley, each one of them, or many of them, with their own development director or their own development strategy, each one of them with their own sort of whatever. We were just doing an inventory of all the tribes in the community, what we call the tribes, the different places where people gather and say me too, right? 54 coalitions in the Lehigh Valley working on different things. We're tired. We're going to a lot of meetings. And so, at what point do we start thinking about it, sort of a broader view for how we more efficiently and effectively use our time and energy? So my advice to the nonprofit, I love the idea of saying 2, 3, 4, 5 of us joining together and working on an issue, but to be really ready for losing some of your identity, and to be saying, it's not about us, it's not about you. And even being able to change our own culture, our own mindset, because for 127 years we operated a certain way, but to shift our own mindset and say, we have played the role of funder, but community convener. We don't have to be the leader, the star, the producer, the whatever. We need to create a place and space where that can emerge. But I think there's advice in terms of how, your question was about how nonprofits. In terms of examples, I think there are several examples. The Healthcare Council is a great example of collective impact, of coming together and thinking about how the healthcare systems work together. Promise Neighborhood has Promise. There are lots of different sort of local, but there also there's a group in Northern Kentucky that their whole webinar was Too Much Collective, Too Little Impact, and 18 coalitions in one community working in education. Like, can we just talk about that? Can we just all sort of sit in the same room and say, all shoulders to the plow in the same direction? Like, we're all agreeing on the same discussion, right? So how can we just sort of agree on that? And so I think that, there's also Erie Together. It's a great example. Erie, Pennsylvania said, we have one of the highest poverty rates in the state of Pennsylvania. We need to solve this as a community. And so they formed this together as a community, a cross-sector group, and they called it Erie Together. You can go on their website. It's a great sort of example on how they formed a cross-sector group of folks to sort of say, these are the indicators we're going to work on together as a community. Can we just agree on 3 that we just want to move the needle on together? And they've seen some great success.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to echo from the nonprofit place, not the funder place, the challenge of and the joy of working in collective impact. So I want to give props to the Ryder Pool Foundation, who has been really trying to do something different. And so there's a group, and I'm fortunate to be involved in it, of 7 of us from 7 completely unrelated nonprofit areas, including the Art Museum, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Catholic Charities, and we've come together to learn. The goal of Ride a Pool was to really teach leaders to think differently about collective impact. And I think kind of the most interesting example of it is we recently have had an opportunity to apply for a grant. And we had to forego our own egos for applying individually as nonprofits to write the grant collectively. And we operate, all of us who are trying to survive with our nonprofits are looking out for us, and we tend to have the old paradigm is about scarcity, not about abundance. But I can only say that working on this project together has been like a life-changing paradigm change. And we may not get it, and we may not do everything right. But I think the 7 of us at least feel like we can become accessible to other people as this program grows, and talk about how we can change our behavior, how we might be able to influence funders differently, how we might be able to influence the for-profits in our community differently. And I think our behavior is really important in this. We can either be a force for change, or we can get stuck in trying to solve humongously large problems by ourselves.
Oh, that's great. And are there plans to scale those types of collaborations upward?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you. Please.
I think in addition to that, a conversation that's been emerging, and it kind of started in Bonnie, we had some webinars on collective impact, and she invited community members there, but some conversations that started there were looking at all these individual studies or issues that nonprofits or other sectors have been working on, and trying to figure out a way to consolidate it all together. So, for example, Urban Nature Center is doing a community needs assessment project, which is great, but there's other assessments out there, and on maybe similar things, and there's so many different programs or organizations doing such great work, but it's all kind of jumbled and mismatched right now. So a conversation that I think is a really great thing to kind of start talking about and trying to figure out something to tackle is how do we get all that really amazing data that all these really great organizations have been coming together with, and putting it all in one place and extracting information from that as well.
That's great. I'm gonna plug the LVRC really quickly. One of our goals for the CBIS is a central repository of Lehigh Valley data. It is a work in progress, but the goal is really that, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, nor should in a community our size, each individual organization have to reinvent the wheel, but rather, stand on the shoulders of giants, work on, move ahead based on what people have done before. So I think absolutely, and I think there's a need and a desire and a thirst for that in the valley. So I think it's just the desire's there, the coordination just needs to fall in place.
It certainly is. Right before that meeting, I had gone to 3 community meetings in about 1 week's time. One was on the Promised Neighborhood, and there was certain information that was passed on through that. One was a charrette for the Easton Planning Commission. There was certain information there. And then, I can't remember the third one, but then we had that meeting and someone announced that they were going to do this other study, right? And at each of those meetings I thought, whoa, I wish I had had the Promised Neighborhood information when I had been at that second meeting, right? And then when I was at the Planning Commission charrettes, I was like, whoa, where are all those people that were doing all these other things? And so we really need something like that before we start a new study, too, right?
Yes.
Maybe I'd like to bring it back to where we started a while back. So we established, I think, that it's about relationships, about trust, about poker games, drum circles, sing-alongs, and also about including the diversity of the community that we live in. How do we do that? How do we create more diverse poker games, drum circles? How do we start building those relationships in our community? Because I think it's as much about building relationships within our communities as it is us building relationships with people in communities. How do we do that? That's also my main question.
I want to make sure that we have on tape how do we make more diverse drum circles. But I think that's a nice encapsulation of the question. How do we get people, and that was actually a question I had as well, is who's not at the table? Who should be at the table? And how do we get everyone to the table?
I mean, I think when we're talking about this, it's going to get messy. So when you're building relationship and you're building bridges across difference, that takes a great deal of skill. It takes a great deal of courage. You know, when we're doing this work, we call it courageous conversations, right? So that if we're really going to not create another nonprofit, right, and create more distance between the problem, the issue, and the people, we're going to have to learn how to show up with our authentic selves, right? It's back to trust. So that takes time, right? And it gets to where are we trying to ultimately go? Because if we're going in the same direction, you know, the vehicle might need to be bigger. And the bigger the vehicle, sometimes the slower the vehicle. And the valley didn't get this way overnight. It's not going to change overnight, right? So we have to be comfortable with the fact that in some of these conversations, there's not going to be a nice bow at the end of it. Okay, we got the problem. Here's the silver bullet. We're going to apply for the grant. Good. Let's continue talking about that. But I think because of agendas and schedules and difference, we don't like that. And funders many times don't like that, right? They're deadlines. So somehow we have to suspend, somebody used the word interrupt. We have to interrupt the practices that we've been doing in order to create a new narrative. You know, we have a proliferation of nonprofits. And I've gone to some meetings this week and said, we're not creating another 501c3. A moratorium on programs. No, I'm not going to another meeting, right? So, well, no, you're going to have to sit down at the table. Well, I don't like it. Does it make a difference whether you like, are you doing this for you, or are you doing it for the community that you wrote a case study about when you went out to do the survey for? Because ultimately, at the end of this, if you keep pulling the string, some of it is about the stability of the institution and not the well-being of the community. And in large part, many times, we are writing grants to continue to fund the institution above the ultimate mission that the institution was founded around. Now, that means that some folk at the end of this conversation, some folks might need to move on into other areas. But we have in the Valley created a tertiary, secondary economy built on poverty and the lack of diversity. And we keep making more programs. She's already said the definition of insanity is we got to do something different. And I think that the skill set that is needed most now are those that can build healthy relationship across difference. Because there are too many tribes, and everybody wants to be, well, you know, right? So how do we eliminate that for the sake? That takes skill, and it takes both head, which we're comfortable with. Most of us in the room, we're comfortable with head. But what we're not comfortable with is heart. And you don't want to be somebody who just thinks with their head and not their heart. That's a danger. There's a movie about that, I think, called Frankenstein, right? But somehow we see that as, that's not an issue. Yeah? When you're dealing with families that are food compromised, and you're dealing with miseducation, and you're dealing with disenfranchisement, that's a heart issue. That's not necessarily located in a strategic plan. Come on. Let's think a little bit broader than that. And if we're teaching from that perspective in our classrooms, if we're teaching just ahead and not heart, we've missed the boat. You know? So I think that's how I would start. And that means when I'm talking to folks that are different, just because they're different, I do not label them as deficient. And I have to hear through my own stuff. You know, in the Mayan tribe, there is a philosophy that it is not until we get through the smoke of all of our baggage that we can see the other as ourselves. And most of us have a lot of smoke. We come to meetings with facades, with agendas, with can we see beyond that? Not to see them as different, but to see them as ourselves. And when we do, there is definite difference, but we're all humans, right? And so we have some commonalities. We have to find our way from the smoke to the commonalities. Now we can talk about, are we going to go in the same direction? Are we going to go in the same direction? So,
I have two things on that. One is I teach a class inside the Northampton County Jail. It's a Women and Gender Studies class. It's actually a Lafayette College class. And I take 12 students in the vans down to the jail. We go in and we have a class with female inmates. It takes us about 5 weeks to get past the smoke. So first week, students leave, oh, isn't that great? We're all connected, right? I'm like, okay, we'll see what happens. So second week, oh my goodness, more stuff is happening. Third week, oh, Dr. Winfield, do we have to do all these get to know you things, right? Fifth week, wow, it's amazing once you get through that, right? Another thing is skill building, right? So what skills do we need to be able to do that, right? I was at a workshop on Saturday at Lafayette College about microaggressions. And microaggressions are about, we'll all sit here and say, oh no, I'm not racist, right? I'm not sexist, I'm not homophobic, right? And I could have lots of examples of that. But then when I take that little online test, so there's an online test that you can take to see how you react to difference. And it's amazing how, I'm actually afraid to take it. Because even though I know that because of my socialization and because we live in a racist society, I'm probably going to come out in a way that I don't want to, there are ways to work on that, right? So microaggressions, the person who gave the workshop is, he was born in Portland, Oregon. He is Chinese heritage, right? He talks about interactions with people. Oh wow, your English is amazing. Where are you from? Where were you born? Oh, I was born in Portland, Oregon. No, where were you born? No, that's not what I mean, right? And he's like, oh, no, I was born in Portland, Oregon, and thank you very much, because I am American. I'm glad that you think I have good English, So there's these things that, once you start learning about them, you realize what you say, And it is amazing. And so if we could learn that, right, and know that some of the things we do and say have amazing consequences, right? And maybe some skill building, and maybe that's something we could do. So, right, the resources is that Lafayette College could have that workshop and invite all of you, not just the faculty and staff, right, but invite community partners so that we could, all of us, learn how to work through those things so that we're not offending people and maybe we're not even aware of it, right? Because none of us would think we're racist. But anyone who, I think, lives in the United States is racist because of the structure of the society and what we've learned, who we interact with, right, and all of that. So I think those kind of skill buildings and how to have those dialogues in a safe way.
To your original question, how do we have more upgrades in terms of those? I was thinking, it's just a matter of, I think, sometimes we're just afraid of knowing where to start. And I don't remember which book it was, one of the Malcolm Gladwell books, right, on community connectors, I think is one of the pieces and things that he wrote about. We need a lot more connectors, and I think a lot more people who are risk takers to just say, I'm gonna have a poker game in my house, I have no idea how to play poker, so we're just gonna get started somewhere, right? And to be okay with that, I think self-importance in our community is gonna kill us. And I think when we are, if we ever catch ourselves in meetings sometimes thinking, I'm too important to be here, as my grandmother would say, we get a little too big for our britches. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that we all have priorities, we all have stuff we have to do, and there's not enough time to join every game, every conversation, every meeting. I'd love to spend more time with Jim. And all I know is that they're doing amazing things in Allentown, and that's great, and I can support it from my position, my perspective. We don't have to be sitting at this poker game together every day, but I trust that what they're doing is really good. And so I'm going to work on my part, and I know he's going to work on his part, and he's going to work on his part. And so I think, to your original question, I think you just have to start. I think you just have to say, so how do we do that? Well, start something. You know, call something at your house and don't worry if people are going to wonder if your house is a mess. You know, like, said my kids, quick, pretend somebody's coming over. So, let's, so get your pants up off the table. So, it's, so I think we're afraid of those things. We're afraid of connecting because we get lost in our own views of what other people might think of us or whatever. And sometimes we just have to be us and just say, I don't know where I'm going to start, but I just need to start somewhere. So.
I think another thing is that we don't have to make that commitment forever, right? So we started this thing in Easton about 8 years ago called the No Name Community. We met at Mr. Bread, which was a coffee shop bakery in downtown Easton that is no longer there. It was just a group of people who were new to Easton and looking for other people, right? We started having coffee at a table, like just 4 people, ended up to be bigger than this. We kept putting more and more tables together. And it was amazingly diverse because someone would come in to buy their coffee and we would invite them, Patrick Palladian, I don't know if you know who he is. He's a jazz musician and he's like totally crazy, right? So he's like, oh, come on, join us. And you'd be like, look like you're looking, like what? And that person would sit and join and then they became more involved in it. But it only lasted like maybe 4 years at the most, right? Then there was something on Facebook, how did you meet so-and-so, right? No name community, no name community, no name. And so we built this little community of people, but we didn't continue to meet, right? We had those conversations, because sometimes you think, oh wow, I'm going to join this, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to start a drum circle, it's going to have to last 10 years or else I'm a failure, right? But it's only, it can be just a poker game for 3 weeks or something, right?
And I'd say too, I ask myself, if I really want this, and if we want this, what am I willing to give up? What am I willing to give up? Community and collaboration is a high-risk venture. I cannot do it thinking that I'm going to come out untransformed. And many times our nonprofits want to transform those folk, but don't want to be transformed themselves. And it is through the mutuality of transformation that community happens. So am I willing to give up self-importance? Am I willing to give up, and that becomes, if you will, the glue that makes the relationship and the venture and the program and the nonprofit work, right? But I've got to be willing to give up something. Getting back to the poker game, right? Am I all chips in? Or do I come just with the poker face?
We are nearing the end, and I feel like I should wrap up the teacher and me, so we should go do an overview of what we learned today. I'm floored, really, by the amount of people in our room, the wonderful perspectives from our panelists, the great questions that we had, so thank you so much for your engagement. And it really does sound like, even though we seem to be talking about some really abstract concepts, that I feel like everyone in the room is in agreement about the value of collaboration and collective impact, and pushing the needle forward by reaching across the aisle, so to speak, and bringing in different partners and thinking creatively, where it's not just nonprofits, but it's also religious communities or corporate communities, and how do we get everybody there. So I think that bodes really well for our valley. But I think I always am left after meetings like this asking, so what now? So I really hope, and I wish we could talk and meet in small groups and do worksheets and things like that. But I will not force you to do that. But I do encourage you to interact with each other after we break and really commit to getting your hands dirty and working, being those connectors and those collaborators, and really taking what we talked about in the larger room and here today, and using that as inspiration for more effective collaboration. So if there are no dying, if anyone has one burning question that they would like to have, yes, please, Dr.
I just want to thank you for bringing this great panel together and having a great session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.